I wouldn't blame Sunak for where he was, because what I will say is this: he was not ready for the task, and Britain was not ready for him. Why do I say that? I say this because he didn't have sufficient political experience. He formally joined politics only in 2015. And from that stage to be fast-tracked to the job of Chancellor, which happened under Boris Johnson, it was something which was a tremendous jump for him. That said, and then to become Prime Minister after 2.5 years from that was an even bigger jump. So what he lacked was political experience, and I say that Britain was not ready for him because I feel that his party, the rank and file of his party, and his party's traditional voters, I'm being quite frank about this, I don't think they were ready for a non-white Prime Minister.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The British election result was a political earthquake that was widely predicted, but it still fascinated the world. So today we ask, how should we understand the result? What do we know about Keir Starmer? And what does the future hold for Rishi Sunak? Joining me from London to help answer those questions is author and senior journalist of almost 50 years standing, Ashis Ray. Ashis Ray, let's start with the results before we come to Starmer and Sunak. Was this a Labour victory or a stunning Conservative defeat? I ask because Labour's vote share has only increased by 2%, whilst the Tory vote share has collapsed by almost 21%. Thereafter, the anomalies of the first-past-the-post system ensured that Labour ended up with 412 seats and the Tories only got 121. So how do you view this outcome, and what sort of mandate has Labour got?
Well, I think you would be right in concluding that it's a combination of a Labour victory and a Conservative defeat. The reason I say this is that as you've correctly pointed out, the vote share for Labour has not increased that much. Indeed, it's more or less static from last time, whereas the Conservative vote has collapsed. Now, the Conservative vote has also suffered from the fact that the far-right Reform Party took away a large chunk of what would have been a Conservative vote, and that really caused problems for the Conservatives. However, the result was very much on the anvil for quite some time, because for at least the last 2 to 3 years, the Conservative Party, the Conservative leadership, they were collapsing, they were disintegrating. And as a result, there was more and more of a chance of Labour coming back. Now, one of the reasons which has caused this tremendous victory on the part of Labour is their tactics. And why do I say that? I say it because what Keir Starmer did was to concentrate on seats which were held by the Conservatives, instead of concentrating on Labour seats, in other words, seats which had been held by Labour. That being the case, Labour suffered a little bit in terms of vote share in their own seats, their traditional seats, what you call their safe seats, whereas the attack on the Conservative seats, whether they were marginal victories for the Conservatives or even bigger victories, I think brought very rich dividends for the Labour Party.
Let me pick up on something you mentioned. The renowned analyst and psephologist Sir John Curtis has said that if reform was not there, the Conservatives could have retained 2/3 of the 250 seats they've lost. How seriously did Nigel Farage's reform, which won, I believe, close to 15% of the vote, damage Tory prospects? I imagine the Tories would have anyway lost, but has Farage's reform made their defeat far worse than it would have otherwise been?
That is correct, largely, but not entirely. The reason I say that is because it is true that the Conservatives may have won up to 90 seats, seats than what they have, but that wouldn't have given them a majority. They lost very badly, as you know. They got only 121 seats in a House of 650. That said, I think it would be wrong to conclude that the reform vote came entirely from the Conservative Party. They also took votes from white working class people who would traditionally have voted for Labour. And so therefore Labour was also affected by the surge in reform's support. And that really gives you a picture of what has happened. The reform vote may be just a protest vote and it may fade away, but we'll have to wait and see. There is, of course, a tendency in Europe in general, Britain included, of the right being on the rise. And the reason for this is obviously a protest against unchecked immigration.
So you don't automatically believe the boast made by Nigel Farage that this is not a one-off protest, this is the start of something big. You don't automatically believe that.
I don't believe what Nigel Farage has said because there's no evidence to substantiate what he said. What I would go on to say is that it's something that both the major parties in this country, namely Labour and the Conservatives, have to be watchful about, because if that protest votes becomes solidified into something more substantial, then there's a great danger to what I would call the fabric of formality and informality and harmonious relationship between people in this country.
Let me touch on two other political parties. The Liberals won 71 seats, which I believe is their best result in over 100 years. Not since 1923 have they done so well. On the other hand, the Scottish Nationalists fell from 45 to just 9. What are the implications of these two results?
I think, again, the strategy of the Liberal Democrats was superb. They concentrated on seats which were winnable rather than concentrate on seats everywhere. And that paid dividends, because what they gained from principally were seats where the Conservatives were holding them. And by targeting those seats, the Liberal Democrats won considerably in the south of England, in the southeast of England, and the west of England.
In fact, the point that you're making is underlined by the fact that the Liberals have fewer votes than Reform, but Reform just won 5 seats and the Liberals won 71.
Absolutely right. There were, of course, traditional, what you would call strongholds of the Liberal Democrats, because they tend to do much better than in the general election in local elections. And therefore, once you hold a council, once you have councillors in certain areas, that gives you a launch pad. And that launch pad, the Reform did not have. The Reform is relatively a new party, although they have a background in terms of the Brexit Party and the UKIP Party. And basically what's happened is that UKIP dissolved into Brexit and Brexit has dissolved into Reform. But nevertheless, their base was not as solid as the Liberal Democrats' base, and they spread their candidates around all over the country. And that is one of the reasons why their percentage is high. That is, I think, a deceptive figure. Whereas the Liberal Democrats, they concentrated on areas where they could win, and that's where their votes were concentrated as well. And so they got very rich dividends.
Now, does the collapse of the Scottish nationalist vote mean that independence for Scotland is buried as a political issue for the foreseeable future?
I think that would be a correct conclusion. The Scottish nationalists certainly were very much in control of Scotland for a considerable period, in fact, more than a decade. And now they have basically had a lot of problems in terms of corruption, in terms of disunity, and therefore the Scottish voters have turned away from them. And it would also be right in thinking that for the time being, for the foreseeable future, I think the independence issue is now very much on the back burner. Traditionally, by the way, the Labour Party has been very strong in Scotland. They disappeared considerably in the past decade because of the fact that the SNP took control of that region. And in that scenario, I think it was the Scottish nationalists who were calling the shots. That said, of course, Labour have now made a tremendous comeback, which was expected again, as was expected their victory overall. And so now they will concentrate more on economic development and such issues, integration perhaps with the United Kingdom more and more. Whereas, as I said, they had a period, they lost, by the way, as you know, the independence vote, the Scottish nationalists, but certainly I think separatism will take a backseat in the foreseeable future.
Ashis Ray, let's move beyond the results. What is the mood in London this morning, the first full day after the results were announced? Is it one of celebration? Is it one of relief? Or is everyone simply getting on with their life?
Well, I think for a start, it needs to be borne in mind that the turnout was relatively low. Only 60% of voters actually exercised their franchise, and that is low for a country like Britain. So therefore, there was a section of voters who were disinterested, who were apathetic, and for whatever reason. But there was also a section of potentially Labour voters who stayed away thinking that a victory for Labour was inevitable, and therefore they didn't bother. They spent the day doing other things. Now, today is a remarkable Saturday. There is, of course, among a very wide section of people, relief, happiness, because they were pretty fed up, I think, by and large, the British people, with the Conservative government. The way it has behaved from the time that Boris Johnson took over the leadership of the party, from the time that he became Prime Minister, I think the party was on the decline. And to that extent, I think people are certainly relieved and happy. But there's also, I think, a bit of sobering effect, because as one of the papers you would be familiar with, the Daily Mail said, it's a loveless landslide. I wouldn't go to the extent of describing it as such, but what I would say is that this is, in terms of the percentage of votes won by Labour, not an extraordinary situation. What is extraordinary is the fact that they won 412 seats in a House of 650, where they needed only 326 for a majority. Now, this is their best ever performance after Tony Blair led Labour to victory in 1997 with 418 seats. And that time, by the way, there was an overwhelming support in terms of percentage of voters lining up in favor of Labour. But what is certainly noticeable today, it being a Saturday, and normally, as you know, the weekend in Britain is sacrosanct, but not today. There's a cabinet meeting which has taken place today, which is quite remarkable, because these things don't normally happen over a weekend, because the weekend is meant to be for your constituency, really, when it comes to politicians. But Keir Starmer is down to business straight away.
Let's talk a little bit about Keir Starmer. The sweep and scale of his victory, as you suggested a moment ago, is reminiscent of Blair's victory in 1997. But Blair captured the mood of the country, and in a sense, he also personified it. Is that true of Starmer, and is that true of today's Britain?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that Starmer as yet has not stamped his charisma, if you like, on the country, as Tony Blair did. Tony Blair's rise was meteoric. The background was similar. Once again, it was a situation in the 1990s of the Conservative Party with a mixture of sleaze and incompetence falling apart. this was a similar instance, but I don't think Keir Starmer has captured the imagination of the British people the way Tony Blair did in 1997. That said, I think everyone agrees that he is a safe pair of hands, he is a secure pair of hands, and the country will do well under him. Don't forget one thing, his performance is remarkable, because in 2019, when Boris Johnson of the Conservative Party won on a landslide, people said that the Labour Party would spend at least 10 to 15 years in opposition, because such was the fervor and euphoria in favor of the Conservative Party. But quite remarkably and historically, I would hasten to add, the Labour Party has won. In 4.5 years, Keir Starmer has completely turned around his party, and they are today in power in a most emphatic manner.
Tell me, how much has he changed Labour to make it electable, and how much credit does Starmer get for that?
Starmer gets a lot of credit because he once again did, as I said a little while ago, what his predecessors did not do. He did not fight or try to fight and save the Labour seats, because he knew that the opinion polls were such that he was going to hold his own seats quite easily. And therefore, he targeted the Conservative held seats. And that's where it really has produced remarkable results, because not only have marginal seats come to Labour, but also safe Conservative seats have come to Labour. And therein lies his tactical brilliance, which I think everybody is talking about.
Now, Oliver Eagleton, the author of the Starmer Project, says, and I'm quoting him, Starmer is accused by critics on the left and right alike of lacking conviction. He's labeled an enigma, a man who stands for nothing, with no plans and no principles. To what extent is that the image of Starmer in the country, a sort of blank, bland individual?
I'm pretty certain about one thing, that Starmer is a man of conviction. But in this day and age, politics is such, communications are such, that you hold back, you keep matters close to your chest. Because if you reveal exactly what you're thinking, then you could get into trouble down the line. So he has kept matters to himself, and what we will see is, I think, a conviction emerging in terms of his actions. What he's faced with is, though, very daunting indeed, because the economy in Britain is in bad shape. The treasury is not exactly full of riches, and therefore he will have to really gather around a good team and work with that team and try to work things out. There's, of course, the economy, there's the health service, there's the education sector. These are vital areas in a first world country. And therefore, those are the areas that he needs to concentrate on. I would add, though, that immigration is an important issue. It has emerged as a very important issue because there's this vast section of Britons who feel that unchecked, illegal immigration is not what they want. And that's exactly what has been happening. If you remember, the Brexit vote was largely about not wanting immigration from Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. What has happened is that Brexit has caused immigration to increase from other parts of the world. It's not only documented immigration, but undocumented. And that is really, that's causing restlessness. And that is also the reason why a party like Reform has now emerged on the picture.
Let me put to you another point that Oliver Eagleton makes about Starmer, this time about Starmer's behavior and attitude when he was head of the Crown Prosecution Service. In a recent piece in the New York Times, Eagleton says that Starmer had, and I'm quoting, a deeply authoritarian impulse. He points out that Starmer did not bring charges against the police when they shot John Charles de Menezes, the Brazilian, who was mistaken for a terrorist, wrongly so. Nor did Starmer prosecute MI5 and MI6 agents who faced accusations of credible torture. And perhaps for many people, most importantly, Starmer, he says, worked hard to drag out the case against WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange. What does all of this tell us about Starmer? The BBC, in a discussion yesterday, suggested he can be quite ruthless when he needs to be. Would you agree?
I would agree with that. I wouldn't go to the extent of calling him authoritarian, because that's too strong a term. But what I would say about him is that he appears to be very firm. And the way he's dealt with his party, a party which was indisciplined, which was leaning towards loony leftism, and to bring that party around and even carry out a cull in favor of centrism, if you like, has certainly demonstrated that he is a very firm individual. That said, I think there are controversies, because his position on Israel has been criticized, and he's lost Muslim votes in this very election because of his stance, which has been very similar to the conservative government, and therefore not particularly empathetic towards Palestine or the Palestinian cause. But there are other areas where I think there's an indication that he is more centrist than left of center.
Would I be right in saying that his ruthlessness showed in particular in his handling of Corbyn, his predecessor? He's not only sidelined him, he's expelled him from the party. Corbyn may have won as an independent in the elections that have just happened, but he's no longer in the Labour Party. He's no longer considered part of the Labour fraternity.
I think it reflects Keir Starmer's ruthlessness in the way that he dealt with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Corbyn, of course, is a serial person in terms of indiscipline. He has voted more than 500 times against his own party in Parliament. So he's not exactly a good example of discipline. But of course, it's a fact that Starmer served under Jeremy Corbyn, was in the shadow cabinet when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. But this anti-Semitism, which Corbyn was associated with, I think was causing problems for Labour, not only when it came to Jewish votes, but also Jewish financial support. And as a result, he took a firm line, Starmer did, and one has criticized this because Corbyn, no matter what, was certainly not a person who was going to go in the direction of the right or any other direction for that matter. But as voters have demonstrated, and he has been very popular in his Islington area of London, Corbyn, where he's been a member of parliament for more than 40 years. And as a result, this has shown in the result where he, as an independent, defeated, I would add, of course, a weak Labour candidate.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Now, Ashis Ray, what would a Labour government under Keir Starmer mean for India? The Labour Party's manifesto spoke of a new strategic partnership, He's also corrected Labour's stance on Kashmir, which was fairly firmly established under Corbyn. So how do you see India-UK relations under Sir Keir?
Well, there are three areas to look at. There are, of course, others, but let me start with the three. First of all, there is no mention in the manifesto or any statement that Keir Starmer made or any speech that he delivered during the campaign of renegotiating or resuming negotiations on a free trade agreement. This, as you know, was initiated by Narendra Modi and Boris Johnson in early 2022, and now 2.5 years have passed. They actually had a target of finalizing a deal by October of 2022, but this obviously did not happen, and it was still being negotiated earlier this year before the negotiators decided that with elections coming up in both countries, I think it was not worth continuing. So that failed, if you like, and there's no indication from Labour, there's no indication from Keir Starmer that FTA negotiations will resume.
Can I interrupt? Surely
Sure.
it is part of the manifesto. Doesn't the Labour manifesto talk about resuming talks and finalizing the FTA quickly? And David Lammy, when he came to India in February, went out of his way to assure the Indian government that Labour would be keen to do it and to do it quickly.
What I'm trying to say is this, that the emphasis is more on making stronger the strategic partnership. Now, the strategic partnership has many elements to it, including security, defense, and such like. The FTA has not been talked about in specific terms. There is, of course, no denial of the negotiations resuming, but my
But the
position on this,
FTA is specifically in the Labour manifesto.
well, I would hesitate to underline that, because when this has come up, as far as Keir Starmer is concerned, he has spoken about the strategic partnership. Now, it could be a fact that in the back of his mind, he does have the FTA, but I would venture to say that he's got a broader relationship in mind. But mind you, a relationship between the British Labour Party and the BJP is a slightly uneasy relationship, because the more natural relationship that the BJP have had is with the Conservative Party. And as you probably know, BJP and RSS fronts in Britain have been vindictively campaigning against the Labour Party for at least the past 5 years. And so their sympathies do not seem to be exactly with Labour. That said, of course, reality kicks in, and you have to deal with whichever government is in power. And as a result, there will be, I think, meaningful contacts between the two countries. The two other points that you mentioned, I think one of them was Kashmir. Yes, the position that was taken on both Kashmir and on Khalistan by the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's left-wing leadership was not exactly friendly towards India. And that has changed and will change under Keir Starmer. There's one caveat, though, I should mention here, which is this, that during the campaign, it was said by Angela Rayner, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, in one of her speeches, that the new government, which has now come into being, will investigate as to whether Britain played a part in Operation Blue Star in Amritsar in 1984. And I can add to that there's been a significant increase in the number of Sikh MPs in the House of Commons this time, and therefore the pressure from this group will increase, and there will be a demand, I think, for a more sympathetic view, if you like, to Khalistan on the part of the present government. But again, I think pragmatism will tell you that this is something that Keir Starmer's natural tendency may not allow.
And the third thing?
And the third thing, of course, the two things really, it was Kashmir and Khalistan. Okay. I think Kashmir very much goes into the background. Khalistan, as I said, is not exactly something that a Labour government would support, because I think good relations with India is very important for Britain, because Britain today, I think, is suffering from an economic crisis, because the trade turnover which existed when Britain was a part of the European Union has definitely gone down. And in order to restore parity, if you like, Britain needs countries like India. It needs to increase trade with India in order to come back to normal.
Can I interrupt? Given what you're saying about the need to restore trade volumes, surely Labour will want to push the FTA, which Indian sources say was pretty close, with the exception of one or two issues, to conclusion. It is a low-hanging fruit that could be fairly easily plucked, to use a metaphor that Indians are very fond of. Won't Labour then want to push for it quickly, or are you still hesitant to believe that?
Well, we don't have evidence as yet. I think it's too early to know whether this government, they've got other priorities, let's face it. It'll be, I think, at least a month or two, if not longer, although there's talk that David Lammy will be visiting India quite soon, and David Lammy is the new foreign secretary. So therefore it could come up in the next month or so, but it's certainly not a priority today. It will not be a priority in the next 1 week, because in the next week, as far as international engagements are concerned, Keir Starmer will be attending the NATO summit in Washington. And therefore, I think India will figure somewhere down the line, and I'm not ruling out an FTA, but I'm not very sure that it's as easy as some people think to clinch a deal, because there were still significant differences between the two sides when the negotiations were suspended, if you like, earlier this year.
Ashis Ray, let's briefly come to Rishi Sunak. In his speech outside Number 10, he acknowledged the anger and disappointment of the country. He apologized and actually said, first and foremost, I want to say I'm sorry. And he accepted full responsibility for his party's debacle. He also went out of his way to say particularly nice things about Keir Starmer. Briefly, how has that speech gone down with the British people?
I think a stage had been reached where the Conservative Party and Rishi Sunak had become bad news for the British people. So I think I wouldn't blame Sunak for where he was, because what I will say is this: he was not ready for the task, and Britain was not ready for him. Why do I say that? I say this because he didn't have sufficient political experience. He formally joined politics only in 2015. And from that stage to be fast-tracked to the job of Chancellor, which happened under Boris Johnson, it was something which was a tremendous jump for him. That said, and then to become Prime Minister after 2.5 years from that was an even bigger jump. So what he lacked was political experience. And I say that Britain was not ready for him because I feel that his party, the rank and file of his party, and his party's traditional voters, I'm being quite frank about this, I don't think they were ready for a non-white prime minister.
Now, Sunak has announced that he will be leader of the Tories till a new leader is chosen. This means he will be leader of the opposition when the House of Commons reconvenes, and at Prime Minister's question time, it will be his duty to grill Keir Starmer. That's the exact reversal of roles that he's got used to over the last 20, 21 months. How easy or difficult will this be for him?
Well, first of all, I think that the Conservative Party has a history of being quite dismissive of leaders who have, in their eyes, let them down. In other words, lost a general election. And so I think before Sunak was pushed, he's jumped, and therefore he's announced that he is filling only a caretaker role until they find a new leader. And that means a contest in the Conservative Party, and a contest in their process takes anything between 1.5 to 2 months. So he will fill this role of leader of opposition in the foreseeable future, in the next few months, and until they find a new leader. And that new leader may not take charge until the party political conference of the Conservatives, which normally takes place either towards the end of September or early October. So yes, there will be at the Prime Minister's questions now a reversal of roles, if you like, with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak as leader of opposition.
I want to end by taking up that point you made that Britain wasn't really ready for its first non-white prime minister. For many people, Rishi Sunak's real legacy is that he was the first non-white prime minister of the United Kingdom. But it is something that happened without any fuss, or as Sunak himself put it in that speech, it was considered unremarkable. Do you really believe that the fact that you've had Sunak, you've had several chancellors who are brown and black, you've had a foreign secretary who's brown or black, you've had home secretaries who are brown or black, do you really believe that Britain hasn't changed?
Britain has changed tremendously. There's no question about that. Britain is also a very tolerant country. Britain is a country where multiculturalism is a matter of state policy. That said, I think it is unremarkable that Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister as far as his MPs are concerned. But when it comes to his party's rank and file and his traditional voters, that is the traditional voters of the Conservative Party, I'm not so sure. What has happened is this, that this hardcore, if you like, the right wing of this country, they still believe that a WASP is the best qualified person to be Prime Minister. In other words, somebody who is white, Anglo-Saxon, and a Protestant. So you need to be culturally British, you need to be of their right color, and that, I think, is what is most acceptable. That is not the majority of the country. And as you have correctly pointed out, there's such a vast change in terms of the attitude from traditionalism to becoming informal. And that is reflected by the fact that top posts, other than the Prime Minister's post in the new government, are held by women. And you have a black foreign secretary. So the Chancellor is a woman, the Home Secretary is a woman, the Deputy Prime Minister is a woman, and you have a black foreign secretary. So that represents a sea change in the culture in this country. But there is still a rump of people, and that is the right-wing rump, who I don't think are particularly happy. They are still resistant to this multiculturalism.
I take the point you're making. You're distinguishing between the country as a whole, which has changed and changed dramatically, and what you call the rank and file of the Conservative Party, its membership, who may not have been ready for their first non-white prime minister. But I notice that the new parliament, which was elected yesterday, has 29 MPs of Indian origin and a further 15 MPs of Pakistani origin, which means just between India and Pakistani origin MPs, the total number is 44, the highest it's ever been. That's another sign of how much Britain is changing. It would have been impossible to think of these figures in the 70s or 80s or even 90s. Today, as Sunak said, it's unremarkable.
Yes, and those figures that you highlighted have been steadily rising over the past, I would say, 40 years. In 1987, Keith Vaz became the first Asian origin member of parliament, and it took some time before the numbers to really start bubbling, and they have been in recent years. As I said, there are any number now of at least 9, as far as I'm concerned, of Sikh MPs in the current parliament as opposed to only 2 in the previous parliament. And of course, if you talk about Indian origin in general, Pakistani origin, those numbers have been going up. So there is greater representation in the cabinet. You have a person of Indian origin in Lisa Nandi in the cabinet, and her father came from Calcutta, an academic who settled in this country, Deepak Nandi. And then, of course, there's Shabana Mahmood, who's of Pakistani origin, who has become Secretary of State for Justice. So Secretary of State for Justice of Pakistani origin, Secretary of State for Culture, who's of Indian origin. And therefore, I think representation is now pretty much a permanent feature.
Ashis Ray, thank you very much for this eye-opening, riveting interview. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you very much indeed.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.